So, in 1853, the 15-year-old Elizabeth, also known as SiSi, daughter of the Duke of Bavaria, accompanied her mother and elder sister Helene from their home near Munich to Austria. The journey had been long, they were delayed en route, and some of their luggage did not arrive, meaning they had to stay in the black attire they were wearing in mourning for the loss of one of their family. This was not going to make an ideal first impression, for they had come to meet the young Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, to receive his former proposal to Helene. Sure enough, Franz Joseph found Helene, who was his first cousin, too quiet. The Emperor was, however, attracted by the beautiful Elizabeth and shortly announced his intention to marry her and no one else. 5 days later, they were engaged. Elizabeth was as smitten with the 23-year-old Franz Joseph, whom she thought dull, humorless, and conservative. When they married 8 months later, in April 1854, the teen bride was seen sobbing in her carriage during the procession through Vienna. Being the Empress consort came as no consolation, since it meant she had to move in intransigently formal imperial court, which would be far cry from the freedom of her childhood. Elizabeth's strongest critic proved to be her mother-in-law, the Archduchess Sophie. She didn't like her at all. Tensions only intensified when Elizabeth gave birth in 1855 to a daughter. Sophie not only took total control of the baby girl's care to the point of preventing Elizabeth from breastfeeding, but even named the child, and after herself, no less. A second daughter was born following year was similarly taken away from Elizabeth. She was shunned by the nobles of the court whom she hated so much, no doubt helped by Sophie's interference for not producing a male heir. These years took a heavy toll on the still teenage Elizabeth, who started suffering from an eating disorder and bouts of depression or melancholy. In 1857, her daughter Sophie fell ill and died during a family trip. In her grief and guilt, she distanced herself from the other child, Gisela. Yet she did not have long to mourn, as she soon became pregnant again for the third time in 3 years. This time she bore a son. Providing the empire with a crown prince named Rudolph at last gave her security and influence and made her even more popular among the people. Unlike the court, they had adored her from the very start. As a tall, slender, and stylish woman, she was considered one of the great beauties of the day. Of particular pride to Elizabeth was her hair. She had beautiful curls so long that they fell to her ankles. She also spent the time learning languages including English, French, and Greek. In fact, Elizabeth looked for any means to escape both physically and mentally the imperial courts and her loveless marriage. Since she struggled to sleep at night, she voraciously read literature, history, philosophy, and wrote her own poetry. Elizabeth suffered from poor health while confined to the palaces. Her solution, which brought about remarkable and instant recovery, suggesting that her ailment may have been psychosomatic, was to travel as often as she could and to as many places as possible from England and Ireland to around Mediterranean. I always want to be on the move, she reportedly said once. Every ship I see sailing always fills me with the greatest desire to be on it. By far, her favorite place was Hungary. Under imperial military control since an uprising in 1848, Elizabeth felt a deep kinship with its people and campaigned for the return of their autonomy. She visited frequently, learned the language, and raised the court's ire further by keeping in household staff made up of the Hungarians. Most significantly, her efforts as a passionate mediator helped secure an Austro-Hungarian compromise of 1867, ending Austria's absolute rule and establishing a dual monarchy. That year, Franz Joseph and Elizabeth were crowned King and Queen of Hungary. While this was a resounding success for Elizabeth and seemed to bring her closer to her husband, at least for a while, as a fourth child, Mary Valerie, was born in Hungary the following year, her mental state remained fragile. In 1889, Elizabeth would be undone by the death of her son Rudolph in what came to be known as Mayerling incident. The crown prince was found dead, aged 30, at the imperial hunting lodge in Mayerling alongside his teenage mistress in what happened to be a suicide pact. Elizabeth fell into deep depression from which she never fully recovered, wearing black for the rest of her life. and retreating even further from public life. She became more restless and reckless with her traveling, staying on the move constantly and visiting places clandestinely and without protection. Reportedly, she declared that her wish would be to travel the world over until I drown and I am forgotten. On 10 September 1898, her yearning for travel had taken her to Geneva, Switzerland. As she walked to catch a ferry, an Italian antichrist named Luigi Lucchini approached and stabbed her with a sharpened needle file in her heart. She died shortly afterwards, aged 60. On hearing the news, Franz Joseph, who had remained deeply in love with her, cried out, I am spared nothing. Hers was a deeply tragic life, forever changed by Franz Joseph's infatuation with a 15-year-old girl instead of her sister. As Elizabeth herself wrote in one of her poems, Oh, had I but never left the path that would have led me to freedom. Oh, that on the broad avenues of vanity I had never strayed. I have awakened in a dungeon with chains on my hands.